I'm sorry, Mr. Castellan Creed, but this really wasn't your comparison video to shine, was it? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're doing a bit more of a fun who would win in a fight type video, where I thought it would be fun to give every single faction's commander in 40k a bit of a challenge, and see whether or not they can handle the new and improved Avatar of Khaine, the incarnation of the Eldar god of war. Obviously this is just a bit of a damage contest meant for fun. It definitely doesn't mean that the avatar or the foe that they fight is necessarily a better model. You have to consider all the other things that they have, things like movement, command abilities, and everything else that they bring to the table. And for the purposes of this video, we'll be going for every single faction that has some sort of nominal commander, so it won't be literally just every single faction in 40k. For armies like Drukhari, Harlequins, Chaos Knights, or Genestealer Cult, there wasn't really a particularly obvious choice that stood out. Sure, you could have created a souped up character with a bunch of Warlord traits and relics, but for this one I felt like having the avatar just fight off against the named characters in 40k, things like Primarchs. Basically, for the purposes of the competition, both the models will attack simultaneously. They'll get one phase of Psychic, Shooting, and Melee. Obviously Psychic is only going to be relevant for some of them. And then we'll compare the amount of wounds that they've dealt to the wounds characteristic of their target, and the one that deals the greatest percentage damage will win the fight. That means that both damage and defense are relevant here, so you don't only need to deal loads of damage, but you also need to try and hold up to the counter attack. To keep things simple, we won't be using any stratagems, but we'll allow these warlords their warlord traits and their whole army rules where necessary. And for the most part, we'll just be comparing the damage of one model against the other. I'm not going to be waiting for points in every single encounter, but I will mention a points cost disparity if it would actually swing the winner. Before we get to chopping up the biggest names in 40k, here's our contender. The Avatar of Khaine is a very strong looking 270 point HQ choice for Codex Eldar. Very tough to kill with toughness 8, 14 wounds, a 2+ save and a 4+ invul, and it halves incoming damage. Really good against big hitting attacks, but means he's at least relatively vulnerable to mortal wounds. In shooting, he can fire that Whale of Doom for a molten beam of strength 12, AP -4, and damage d6+2. Just the one shot though, so it's often going to get caught on invul saves. And in melee he makes 7 attacks with it, at strength 14, AP -5, and again an enormous damage d6+2. Basically the avatar just brings masses and masses of raw might to the table, and perhaps his biggest issues are things like Psychic to avoid invul saves, and very strong invul saves of his targets, which could easily stop a fair few of his mass damage attacks. In any case, let's kick this off and try and chew through every faction commander in the game with our fighty war god. Our first contender into the ring is Rabute Guilliman, Lord Commander of the Imperium and Primarch of the Ultramarines. Defense-wise, his toughness 6 has 9 wounds and a 3+ invul save, and a nice chance of resurrecting on death. And against the Avatar, he'll be striking with the Emperor's Sword, 7 attacks with Shock Assault at strength 8, AP -4, damage 3, and the chance to deal some all-important mortal wounds on 6s. With the Avatar's shooting, the Wailing Doom averages 1.2 wounds against his 3+ invul save. Obviously that is an average based on multiple turns of shooting. In reality it gets through or it doesn't, so it's quite swingy. And the average expected damage output from his melee attacks is about 9 wounds after saves. Guilliman's may be a particularly tricky one to account for in this sort of math hammer, as of course he's got a very all or nothing chance to resurrect on death. You roll the dice, if you get a 1 to 3 then he's dead for good. On a 4+ he stands up with d6 wounds remaining. So if the Avatar does lay him low, which on average he would, you've got a 50-50 chance of being completely dead, or standing up with a few wounds left. On average the ability regenerates him 1.7 wounds though, if you fought this over multiple games. In any case, this averages out to the Avatar dealing around 8 wounds compared with the Primarch's 9, so a 90% damage against Guilliman. Unfortunately for him, Guilliman just really can't stand up to this. His Hand of Dominion's shooting is really quite blunted, it's only a few shots, wounds on 5s, and the half damage hurts, so it only averages 0.5 wounds to the Avatar. The Emperor's Sword will be wounding on 4s, and the mortal wounds are really quite a big deal, as the damage for those aren't halved. So in a single round of combat, Guilliman deals around about 5 or 6 wounds to the Avatar, averaging 40% damage. Currently the Avatar can kind of laugh off the damage of the Primarch of the Ultramarines. The Avatar does cost significantly less as well, though admittedly a lot of the abilities of Guilliman are in his command abilities, so that's where a lot of his value lies. Our second contender is Morvenn Vahl of the Adeptus Sororitas, a High Abbess and Lord of Terror. She costs 280 points, is a little bit weaker on the stat line with strength and toughness 5. In defense, she's got 8 wounds, a 2+ save, 4+ invul, and like the Avatar, has a half damage mechanic. And she's actually got rather a lot going on both in terms of shooting and combat. She's got missiles and a relic heavy bolter to fire at the Avatar, and her melee strikes at strength 8, AP -3, flat damage of 3, 6s to wound getting mortals. Her Warlord trait allows her to reroll hits and wounds, and she also has the option to fight again as well. That's only a once per game ability, but seems like it to be well worth it against this Avatar. I also gave her the Sacred Right for exploding 6s to hit in combat as well, just to add a little bit more insult to injury. With the Avatar's attacks, it really isn't too different a story to when fighting Guilliman. She doesn't have the 3+ invul, but does have half damage, and it kind of balances out. The Avatar of Khaine averages around 8 or 9 wounds to her, dealing slightly over 100% damage, usually going to be making her a martyr. When Morvenn Vahl strikes back, she manages to do a reasonably impressive 2 wounds in the shooting phase, between Fidelis the Heavy Bolter and her Paragon missiles, and with that Sacred Right, her Lance of Illumination will deal almost 6 wounds on average per time that she fights, so if she does use her Fights Again ability to go into Rage mode, then it averages out at a very impressive 13.6 wounds out of 14. That's going to be killing the Avatar very slightly more often than not. Overall, it's actually a spectacularly close fight between the Avatar and the higher best, provided she's fighting twice. I guess the fighting twice thing does actually depend on her living to do it, but even if she does manage it, it's a very small victory for the Avatar at 106% damage over 97. Next up to the plate we have another High Lord, and this time it's Captain General Trajann Valoris of the Adeptus Custodes. Perhaps one of the single strongest models for the points in the game. He only costs 160 for some reason, but is able to punch far above his weight. Durability wise, he's toughness 5, 8 wounds, a 2+ armor, and 4+ invul, and he has an inbuilt 5+ feel no pain from his adamantine mantle. On the offensive, he has 6 attacks that he can reroll the hit rolls for, strength 10, AP -3, damage 3, and he has his powerful moment shackle rule, which can either allow him to change a save damage throw to 0, or again has a fight again rule. This time the Avatar has a slightly easier time against Trajann Valoris. The 5+ feel no pain is a little bit less powerful than the half damage, so it means that you're averaging just over 10 wounds to Mr. Trajann for an 128% damage in total. In return, we've assumed that he's in the Emperor's Chosen Shield Company for a reroll to wound. His Watcher's Axe Guardian Spear just isn't really up to the job for much range damage output, but he does put in a fairly respectable showing for himself in melee. 4 or 5 wounds with that Watcher's Axe, and then fighting again, that'll be another 4 or 5 wounds, presuming he lives to do so. It works out to be kind of similar whether or not he uses that moment shackle for fight again, or to ignore one of the Avatar's mighty wound roll attacks. If he uses it on the defensive, he will take a fair amount less damage, but also deal far less damage to the Avatar as well. Overall, the Avatar around about doubles him out, 128% versus 64, a clear win for the Avatar there, and the Avatar does still win the per points fight as well. Again though, given his great command abilities for the Adeptus Custodes, he is a ridiculously powerful choice for his points. Next into the ring we have Draigo of the Grey Knights, the Supreme Grandmaster who got lost in the warp. This one's the first of our combatants that can use psychic powers, and he'll certainly use them to very good value. In melee he'll be striking with a Titan Sword, strength 8, AP -4 and damage 3, and perhaps he more than most is uniquely placed to take on the Avatar of Khaine, as each time this Warlord makes an attack against a demon unit, invulnerable saving throws can't be made against the attack. The Avatar is technically a demon, it has the keyword, and with AP -4 that really is a massive debuff against the Avatar's defensive profile. On the defensive, he's got 7 wounds and a 2+ save, but more importantly his Relic Shield gives him a 3+ invul, so he's not even particularly easy to squash either. Damage-wise for the Avatar, it maths out to be basically the same as Trajann Valoris or Guilliman before his resurrection. Between the Wailing Doom and his melee attacks, it'll be around about 10 wounds after the dust has settled. It does add up to a bit of a bigger percentage damage increase though, as Draigo only has 7 wounds. In return, Draigo steps up and he'll be using the Tide of Banishment. That's the one that gives you reroll hits and wounds of 1 against demons. His Storm Bolter doesn't really make all that big an impact, but his psychic powers really do. First up, he'll attempt Vortex of Doom. This one deals 2d3 mortal wounds if he manages to cast it, but accounting for the chance of failure, it's only 2.3. And for his second spell, I think the best that we can do is Smite. Mortal wounds are very effective against the Avatar, He'd absolutely love to use Empiric Amplification against most targets for +1 damage on his weapons, but seeing as the Avatar halves damage, it unfortunately doesn't make any difference. In any case, ignoring the invulns, that Titan Sword really does go into bat. It averages about 6 wounds against him, even with the ×2. So on average you're dealing 10 wounds out of 14, 72% damage. Still not going to face up against the Avatar, and doesn't win on points either. Still though, that's really not a bad showing from Draigo, I think. Ignoring the invulns does help. Next up, and perhaps not really fancying his chances, is Belisarius Cawl, Archimagus Dominus of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Cawl's massive augmentations give him a wound characteristic of 8, his toughness 6, has a 2+ save, a 4+ invul, and also has -1 damage. Really though, his abilities are a lot more suited to command than actual main melee. He does have a fairly decent ranged attack in the Solar Atomizer, D3 shots at strength 10, and will give him the full damage D3+3 for being within half range, but his melee really isn't up to all that much. Essentially he is going to be striking the Avatar at damage 1 due to the half damage thing, and his flurry of Mechadendrites isn't very effective against hard targets. Overall, on the defensive profile, he is a little bit easier to chew through than some of the other contenders. The Avatar manages 12 or 13 wounds against him, 157% damage, and as expected, Cawl just doesn't really shape up very well. The Solar Atomizer averages less than 2 wounds. I probably should have used the Arc Scourge over the Omniscient Axe in hindsight, but in reality it isn't going to make the biggest difference. Even if I had used that, he'd still be looking at a damage output in the low 20%. Cawl really doesn't want to be tangling with the Avatar, though I guess he puts in a bit more of a showing for himself than Creed, as we saw at the start. For the Imperial Knights, they don't really have a default Supreme Commander per se, but mainly because I just wanted to see how an Imperial Knight would get on against the Avatar, I thought we'd have Canis Rex step up to the plate. The chain-breaking 3-blade hero. As a super heavy walker, he's a 430 point monster with toughness 8 and 24 wounds. He's got an invul at range but not at melee, which is going to cost him. He strikes back with a d6 shot Las Impulsor with damage d6, very much a great big weapon of war there. And when he swings in combat, he attacks with Freedom's Hand, a strength ×2 Paragon Gauntlet with AP -4. It does give him -1 to hit, but it's got a huge damage characteristic of 2d6, with the lowest characteristic that it rolls being a 6. Unfortunately for Canis Rex, really big tough models that don't have that big invul protection are the sort of thing that the Avatar really gets on well against. The Wailing Doom in shooting is still slightly blunted against that 5+ Ion Shield phase, but the Avatar can really go to town in combat, 21 wounds, adding up to around about 23 on average, 97% damage, and really quite a good chance to one-shot Canis Rex. Unfortunately, despite striking with all the firepower of an Imperial Knight, the Las Impulsor does only average 2 wounds, despite essentially striking like d6 las cannons, and Freedom's Hand doesn't really get on too well against the half damage characteristic and the invul. If it gets a strike through, then the average damage is really high, but Canis Rex only gets to make 4 attacks with it, and they hit on 3s. Overall, it's another big and quite easy win for the Avatar. 97% plays 46 damage. When the Avatar kills Canis Rex, I guess the Hector will be able to get out, but from there I don't really fancy his chances in bringing down the Avatar of Khaine. Moving into the Forces of Chaos now, and this is where we're going to start giving the Avatar a real challenge. The Imperium tends to be led by normal-sized humans, so let's see how he gets on against some demon monstrosities. First into the ring for Chaos Demons, I thought Be'lakor was a reasonable leader, the first Demon Prince of Chaos Undivided, and having received the recent massively stunning new model and powerful datasheet. Be'lakor costs 380 points, he's got a lot of shadowy defences, toughness 7, 16 wounds, a 4+ invul, at a -1 to hit built in where your opponent can't re-roll the hit rolls. On the offensive he casts a couple of psychic spells, but more importantly has the fairly terrifying Blade of Shadows, 6 attacks striking at strength 12, AP -4, damage D3+3, and most importantly for the Avatar, ignores invul saves. It kind of feels like the Avatar might finally be fighting a foe on its level. When the Avatar swings, the Wailing Doom is especially useless, it's -1 to hit and wound at shooting, so only averages less than 1 wound going through. And in melee he finds his combat attacks similarly blunted, his -1 to hit, and Be'lakor also chooses to try and cast Penumbral Curse as well, a psychic power that gives his melee attacks -1 to wound as well, so it isn't going to get quite as much damage. Overall, he's averaging 10.4 wounds out of 16 wounds to Be'lakor, certainly not killing the Dark Master. In return, Be'lakor's got no shooting, but he also does throw Smite out there for a little bit more damage. I wrote 2 wounds here, but really it should be 1.8 on average, accounting for super smites and the chance to fail. Then the Blade of Shadows gets to work, hitting on 2s, wounding on 3s, and then cutting straight through invul saves, so he's saving on 6s. That one deals 7.4 wounds, giving you a total of 9.2, which very slightly just edges the Avatar out. He'd get 66% damage output, not 67% as I wrote here, but it's still just a tiny bit ahead of the Avatar's 65. It does seem that we've finally found a foe that can best the Avatar of Khaine, though admittedly on a per points basis it does mean that the Avatar's still ahead. Be'lakor's 380 points, so cost a whole load more, though again I would bear in mind that Be'lakor adds other things on the table, command abilities and a faster movement with fly, which does mean he's maybe a bit more likely to get the charge rather than the other way around. Still though, he is the first faction commander to be able to best the Avatar. Next up for the Chaos Space Marines we have Abaddon the Despoiler, leader of the Black Crusades and certainly another super powerful model. His 220 points give you a crazy amount of abilities. On the offensive, Dracnium works out to be the best, only strength 6 but a big damage 3, and typically with Hateful Assault, he's going to be striking with 10 or 11 attacks with this thing. It combines super well with his buffing abilities as well. He gets a reroll or hit rolls, and his Warlord trait allows him to get exploding hits on 5s, so usually he's going to be winding up with far more hits than he even has attacks. On the defense, he's maybe fairly similar to the Imperial faction commanders, toughness 5 and a 4+ invul, and halving damage. When the Avatar strikes, the half damage certainly comes into bat. Between the Wailing Doom shooting and melee, he does slightly manage to kill him, but it's really quite a close run thing. But despite his really powerful and generalist profile, Abaddon's profile just isn't really suited to fighting the Avatar, to be honest. The Talon of Horus just isn't really very powerful enough on the shooting side, and despite an insane amount of attacks, wounding on 5s really hurts Dracnian. It only gets around about 5 wounds. Overall, this averages out at 35% damage, though I would bear in mind that with a bit of extra support, Abaddon could get significantly better. He could activate a command point for +1 to wound, that'd get him more into the 50% sort of mark, so make a far better showing for himself really quite easily. I think it's maybe just not the best matchup for the Great Despoiler. He absolutely obliterates lower toughness infantry, and of course he has crazy command abilities and is still one of the most efficient models in the game. Next up though, we come to one of the biggest challenges on the entire list. Mortarion is the highest point cost model that the Avatar will be fighting today, at a massive 490 points, so let's see if he can slay the Primarch of the Death Guard. Mortarion is famously hard to kill, 18 wounds at toughness 8, and then some insane layered defences, a 4+ invul, a 5+ feel no pain, and a -1 damage thrown in as well, so he really can just make massive damage disappear. He's got an enormous amount going for himself in combat as well, a lantern pistol, a couple of useful psychic powers, and then his main combat attack will be striking with 7 attacks all the way up at strength 16, AP -4, damage D3+3, re-rolling wound rolls with the plague weapon ability, and he can re-roll hit rolls as well if he commands himself to do so. Basically, Mortarion is just about made for killing the very biggest and toughest threats around. Before the Avatar even gets to strike, Mortarion casts Miasma of Pestilence on himself, so I've taken the chance for him to successfully cast Miasma into the numbers here. That'll give the Avatar a -1 to hit both at shooting and in melee. With that, plus all the other layered defences, the Wailing Doom just can't really cut through this guy anywhere near as much as some of the others that we've seen. We're only averaging 0.7 wounds in shooting, or around about 5 wounds in melee. The toughness, the invul, the feel no pain and the -1 damage, they all bite into the excessive damage output. Overall, the Avatar can only muster around about a third of his damage, 31% dealt to the Primarch. In return, Mortarion can snap off a shot with the Lantern, and attempts to cast both Miasma and Smite, bolstering his defense and adding a little bit more damage. The great sweeping blows of Silence will average around about 9 wounds to the Avatar. Hitting and wounding on 2s re-rolling, you've got a very good chance of converting all those attacks into saving throws, and overall totals up to be around about 11 wounds on the Avatar. A great big 79% damage there. While the Avatar's strong, it doesn't seem to be able to face up to this Demon Primarch. Not only does Mortarion win convincingly, but he's the first model to actually win the damage contest on a per points basis as well. He does cost quite significantly more, but he also does more than double the damage on this percentage differential. It seems that if you're looking to kill a heavy hitter in melee, Mortarion is your man. Next up, we'll see how the Avatar gets on with his superhuman brother Magnus. Primarch of the Thousand Suns, there are some similarities with his datasheet. He is pretty tough with 18 wounds, that only being toughness 7 and getting -1 damage but not the feel no pain is going to allow the avatar a fair few more attacks. In terms of damage, he has no shooting, but of course he casts an awful load of psychic, and is basically always going to be able to cast the psychic really reliably. He gets the innate 1000 Suns bonus, and also +2 to cast at base. In combat, again he's going to be striking at a massive strength 16, this time only flat damage 3, but if you inflict wounds but don't kill your target, they take d3 mortal wounds as well. Damage-wise, when they square off, the avatar does a fair bit better against Magnus than Mortarion. Magnus pulls a very similar move to his brother, casting Glamour of Tzeentch to give him a -1 to hit. Again, that will impact the avatar's attacks at shooting and in melee, and he does have a far more likely chance to cast it than his brother. Still though, the avatar manages 10 wounds with his raw might this time, 55% of Magnus's total lives. In return, there really are a whole ton of options that Magnus could choose to cast on the psychic front. It's possible that there could be better combos within this, but I went for Glamour of Tzeentch for the -1 to hit, Twist of Fate for a very good chance to ignore invul saves. Even with its very high casting value, Magnus is almost certain to get it off, and Gaze of Magnus, essentially Magnus's version of Smite, where he's either getting d6 mortal wounds or a big 3d3 if he rolls high, and then that's chased down with Malevolent Charge. Magnus generates his own Kabbalistic ritual points, which he can spend for an extra d3 mortal wounds if he wants to. That's 6 wounds done already in Psychic, as well as making the avatar -1 to hit and removing his invul save. In combat, the Blade of Magnus averages 6 or 7 wounds, another very decent chunk of damage, yielding a total of around about 12 or 13 wounds on the avatar, 89% damage, and handily beating this Icon of Khaine. On a per points basis, it's actually really quite close on this one. On these numbers, the avatar does very slightly edge him out. I think it's certainly possible though that a different combination of spells might well have let Magnus pull ahead. Potentially swapping out Twist of Fate for Doombolt might have been a more sensible idea. Ignoring invuls is okay, but almost guaranteeing 3 mortal wounds might have been slightly more powerful. In any case, it's another victory to the Demon Primarchs. Moving into Xenos next. The avatar kind of represents the craft worlds in my mind. The Harlequins kind of don't have a named character to square off against, but I thought it would be interesting to fight the avatar against the Yncarne, the Inari avatar of death. The Yncarne's 250 points, has a sword that's got d3+3 damage and again ignores invuls a bit like Be'lakor, casts a couple of powers from the Revenant psychic discipline, and gives the avatar a bit of a taste of its own medicine in terms of defensive rules. Again, it halves damage, but it's a little bit less tough and doesn't have as many wounds. Between the invuls and the half damage, the avatar does struggle to make a bit of an impact on the Yncarne. He averages around about 8 wounds between his 2 attacks. The half damage and the 4+ invul do bite into that, and gives him a 68% damage overall. In return, the Yncarne strikes first with the shooting of its swirling energy vortex, and then I felt the 2 best spells from the Revenant discipline would just be the mortal wounds. Smite plus Gaze of Aeneid give you 3.2 mortal wounds, and it does seem that Gaze of Aeneid is actually the better option compared with making its melee +1 to wound, which has really quite a high chance of failure. In any case, the Sword of Souls certainly makes its presence felt in melee, 5.5 wounds after cutting through those invul saves, giving you around about 8.7 wounds on the avatar. Interesting that it actually does more damage to the Avatar of Khaine than the avatar does to the Yncarne, but because the Yncarne's not quite as tough, the Avatar of Khaine does very slightly win this fight on a 68% versus 62% damage. Points-wise, again, it's very, very close. The Yncarne's very slightly cheaper, but the avatar does still come ahead very slightly on a per point basis. For the Tyranids, we have the Swarmlord. I know we've got a new and dangerous new profile for him going around the internet, but seeing as Codex Tyranids isn't actually released yet, we'll still be fighting with his current profile. It does feel a bit more of an 8th edition Codex datasheet, I'm afraid. He costs 240 points, and still has no slouch in melee, but it does look like he's going to be getting a fair bit stronger in raw combat ability. On the offensive, he's got a couple of psychic powers and strikes with 6 attacks at strength 8, AP -3 and damage 3 with a chance for some mortal wounds. And then in defense, he's got a toughness 7, a very nice 3+ invul save and 12 wounds of toughness. When the avatar strikes, the Swarmlord will be attempting to cast Catalyst on itself. That's the one to give it a 5+ feel no pain, and it does blunt the attacks of the avatar really quite a lot, particularly in combat, where the avatar also has to contend with that 3+ invul. The Wailing Doom just does over 1 wound, the melee attacks do around about 7 on average, giving you 68% out of 12 wounds, certainly not one rounding the Swarmlord. In return, until the Swarmlord gets his crazy buff datasheet, he just can't really muster that much of a challenge. Psychic wise, we've already accounted for Catalyst, and Smite averages almost 2 wounds. In melee, his current form's Bone Sabers just do feel a bit weedy for a character of his supposed threat, only averaging just north of 3 wounds to the Avatar after halving damage. It shakes out at 36%, plays 68. The Avatar doesn't really have too much trouble offing the Swarmlord. Again though, like a lot of the more leadership type characters, a lot of his value is really locked up in that double move that he gives other Tyranids. At the moment, his melee profile is almost just a nicer side. For the Tau, Commander Shadowsun jumps in, 150 points, and thoroughly outclassed here I'm afraid. Her fusion blasters can chip away around about 1 or 2 wounds against the Avatar. The Avatar can absolutely thoroughly laugh this off, before utterly demolishing her and her drones with the Wailing Doom. The drones perhaps make the Wailing Doom's attacks a little bit clunky, particularly with their invul saves. She might even survive a turn if she's lucky and rolls well on the invuls, but there's absolutely no way that she's winning this fight overall. For the Necrons, I was kind of tempted to use the Nightbringer, but if we are sticking to faction commanders, it will be the Silent King, and it does turn out that he's more than capable of holding his own. Mr. Zarek is a Lord of War choice that'll cost you 420 points at the moment, and with his Triarch of Advisors plus Menhirs, he's got really quite a lot of ways to attack the Avatar. The Menhirs pump out some massive damage 6 shooting, as a scatter attacks from the Scepters and the Staffs. Then when he does get to combat, he's going to be striking with a fairly impressive 13 attacks of various strengths and powers. Defense wise, he's got a lot of wounds and a 4+ invul save, plus those Menhirs can be kind of annoying to deal with, as they might well force some overkill from the Avatar's attacks. When the Avatar strikes, the Wailing Doom averages 1.5 wounds, and the melee attacks average 13.3. To account for the Menhirs splitting the damage for the Avatar, it's quite likely to kill both of them in this first round of combat. It could be quite swingy for how much damage the Avatar will lose due to overkill, but I think about 4 wounds seems kind of likely. Overall, with a pretty impressive amount of wounds that Zarek has though, the Avatar's only managed 11 wounds out of 26, 41% damage. Shooting back, the Silent King gets the 2 Menhirs, his Scepter and the Staff. Between the lot of them, they really pack a very potent shooting punch, should be 4 or 5 wounds on average, much better than most other characters. And then between the 3 portions of the Triarch, you're getting around about the same amount in melee as well, averaging you almost 8 wounds out of 14, or 55% damage. It's kind of an interesting one, this one, as the Avatar will be degraded after these strikes have happened. The Silent King's main base would generally be fairly unscathed, but he would have lost the 2 big shooting attacks from the Menhirs. If it goes to further rounds of combat, I do believe that the Silent King would probably win the fight. He should have a very good chance to kill the Avatar in the next round of combat. The Avatar's unlikely to kill the Silent King in the next round, and I believe that the obeisance generators that the Silent King has have got a really good chance of actually tipping the fight. As basically when the 2 fight each other in melee, the Avatar will always be fighting last. It does mean that even on this average rolling, maybe the first round of Avatar attacks should have been at his degraded profile, as on average the Silent King should be able to degrade him before he gets to swing. Overall though, I think it adds up to a fairly convincing win to the Silent King. Though the Avatar is still slightly ahead on a per points basis due to costing 150 points less, admittedly without any of the powerful command abilities of the Silent King. Finally, we've got the biggest, baddest orc in the galaxy to challenge the Avatar. Ghazghkull Thraka is an interesting prospect to fight, 300 points worth of orky might, and striking with Gork's Claw for a big 5 attacks at strength 14 and a huge damage of 4, a whole load of fairly inaccurate shooting from Mork's Roar, and perhaps most importantly on the defensive side, it means that he can't take any more than 4 wounds in melee, meaning that the Avatar is completely incapable of killing him in one round of combat. He's got a few other interesting powerful things going on, +1 attacks from his Warlord trait and the Goths trait, both of which make his melee a bit more mighty. In battle, this means that the Avatar really does quite badly against him in terms of expected damage. The Wailing Doom's shooting is likely to either deal you 4 wounds or 0, it averages out at 1, depending on whether or not it can wound him and punch through the invul. In theory, the Avatar's melee should strike at around about 13 wounds against Ghazghkull, but again, because he just doesn't really care about any damage besides 4 wounds in each phase, that's converted down to an average of 4, meaning you could expect around about 5 wounds on Ghazghkull or 43% damage. Unfortunately for the Prophet of the War though, Ghazghkull's attacks just really don't go well into the Avatar's profile. Mork's Roar usually averages less than 1 wound, and Gork's Claw is particularly painfully punished by the half damage thing. dropping down from 4 wounds to 2 wounds if he gets one through the invul, and even with his Goth's benefits on the charge, he only averages 4 wounds. Overall, that stacks up to 33% damage on the Avatar. Kind of interesting that these massively dangerous combatants haven't really made much headway against each other. Overall, it is a win for the Avatar. Ghazghkull's degrading profile does make him a bit more dangerous in later rounds, but it's not going to be enough to make up the difference. So that just about brings us to the end of our great Avatar Supreme Commander standoff. And when the dust settles, we have a few victors emerge, but really the clear winner here does appear to be Mortarion. He's the only Supreme Leader who manages to both beat the Avatar on raw numbers and also on a per point basis. If you need to kill a supremely hard target, the Lord of Plagues is generally going to get it done well. Otherwise, if points aren't a factor, Be'lakor, Magnus and the Silent King all also beat the Avatar, though the Avatar really does make them work for it, and deals a very mighty amount of damage to all of them. Finally, on a per point basis, perhaps the nearest rivals to Mortarion are the Yncarne, Morvenn Vahl and Magnus. The Yncarne and Morvenn Vahl were very narrowly beaten and roughly the same points cost as the Avatar, and Magnus was very close to the Avatar on a per points basis with all his psychic might. So anyway, hope you've enjoyed a fun little experiment there. Let me know what you think of these theoretical matchups. Did they go how you'd expect them to go? Did some of them do better or worse than you thought they might have? Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments. If you have enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep regular 40k stuff coming, with new videos out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all this stuff on the channel, I'd just like to mention the Auspex Tactics Patreon page, which is what allows me to keep these videos coming quite so regularly. Making all the content does take an enormous amount of time and effort, and if you are enjoying regularly, any support is appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.